Welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray, CPA. My guest today is Richard Lambie. Richard is a professional fiduciary. He has his own company here in San Jose, Silicon Valley. I've known Richard for a number of years. Before he became a professional fiduciary, he worked for a number of years as a trust officer at a bank, and most recently I can remember at Bank of the West. Now, how many years have you had your own company now, Richard?
16 years.
16 years with his own company. So anyway, he knows his stuff in the area of being a professional fiduciary. So today we're going to be talking about what is the role of a professional fiduciary. And so just to sort of introduce you to this professional and how they can be of service to you and to your family. So Richard, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, very welcome. Happy to be here.
Okay. Richard, why would someone choose a professional fiduciary or a trust company instead of a family member or a friend as a conservator or a trustee or an executor?
Well, if I can avoid the question to start off with that, Mike, and detract for a little bit, the fiduciary is really a job title.
Okay.
And so for somebody to get a job title, you've got to figure out what the job is. So
all right.
Somebody's looking at their estate plan, they've built up some assets, and they're looking at how to manage things. Either during their lifetime, should they become disabled, or in the event that they should die. So that's what we're really looking at is, what sort of job title would a professional fiduciary take on in a family for an individual dealing with the assets and that sort of thing. So very often people would utilize a professional fiduciary if they were a single person that didn't have any children but had built up some assets during their lifetime. So they've got nobody that's really close to them and nobody that's really trusted. So they want a professional to assist them with that type of job. So you're looking for somebody who's got that skill set in terms of dealing with financial assets, and that can range everything from the bank account, from the real estate, all the way through brokerage accounts, investment properties, real estate, many different types of real estate. So you're looking for somebody that could take that on when the fiduciary is included in the estate plan, to have the level of, to put it simply, trust. So that when the plan's completed, that individual can take on that task, take on that job title of being potentially the trustee under a trust. That would be one fiduciary title. They could be named as an executor in a will, another type of title. They could be an agent under a durable power of attorney to take on assets that are not titled in a trust, that could be outside the trust. So there are a number of different hats, and that's what I've threaten my staff with, is getting a shelf and putting a row of hats on there, and just to see what hat we're wearing today, whether I'm acting as the capacity as trustee, a conservator, which would be a court appointed, an executor, an agent, exactly which one of the varieties that could be.
Yeah. So maybe just as an example for a moment, from an experience that you and I shared together with one of my clients, I had a situation with a senior client, husband and wife, and anyway, I could tell basically that his health was declining. Just didn't look good when he was visiting, and so I said, have you thought about what's going to happen if something happens to you? Have you provided for that, for somebody to step in? He said, well, I have been thinking of it. And then he had an episode, I think it was high blood pressure or something, but anyway, he ended up being hospitalized. And I said, I think we need to do something now. And so talked to the family, particularly to the children. They had adult children, and I said, is there anybody that can step in? And the person really that they had intended to be the trustee was actually living in another state, and so it was pretty inconvenient for him. And then there were some other daughters, and basically they're saying, listen, we've got our own lives going on. We just don't have time to do this, to look after mom and so forth, all the time, and take care of all of her stuff. We just know it would be a time-consuming job, and we just don't think that we could handle it. And I said, well, then you folks should be thinking about some sort of a professional fiduciary. And so we ended up having Richard come in and helping out. And he's actually, in this particular case, functioning as a co-trustee, which I know isn't his favorite. But anyway, but this way we've made sure that the bills could be paid and that Mom is being looked after health-wise and so forth. And it's worked out very well for that family.
Right, and that circumstance worked out very well. I believe we first got engaged with these folks in about 2002, and as Mike was saying, the dad was in failing health at that time, but in fact did pretty well. I think he lived another 3 or 4 years, and we're able to marshal the assets, get things under control, put together a consolidated reporting on the assets, reporting not just to Mom and Dad, but also out to the other family members as well. So Mom and Dad felt pretty good about that. You know, they had somebody who would come into their home, go through the assets, deal with the investment professionals and that type of thing. So I think that gave Dad, you know, for the rest of his years, some degree of comfort. And then in 2005, when the gentleman passed away, obviously we're dealing with a widow situation. There's a lot of emotional trauma going on. So to have somebody who already knew what the assets were, there was no real transition beyond some retitling and all of the routine things that go on with trust administration. But because it had been set up well through your efforts, and to a great degree there, Mike, the transition when Dad passed away was relatively seamless. A good variety of assets, as you know, in that case, with not only stock accounts but privately held corporations and that sort of thing. So enough individual assets to keep it interesting. But I think that has allowed the family from 2002 up to today, in fact, to operate and relax a little bit. So when they have family get-togethers, it's not a business meeting, it's more of a family engagement, because they know that this professional somewhere in the background there is dealing with all of their finances, making sure the credit card bills are paid, taxes are paid on time, and that type of thing. So it's worked out very well in those circumstances.
That's great. Okay. I'm glad that it all worked out. Now, if, let's say I have been named as a trustee or executor, and I haven't had an experience or education in that area, what are some things to think about before accepting?
Well, the biggest thing, and I obviously as a professional I have a checklist of things to go through, but the first thing you want to get a hold of is the trust document. You know, assuming that you're going to step in as a trustee, not necessary, but you know, we'll use a trust as an example. So you want to make sure that you get a hold of the document, you read it thoroughly. Make sure you got any amendments, because a lot of folks go back in and they like to add a few people, delete a few people, and you know, it's very curious. The attorneys will tell you about this. People like to use their trust document as a weapon in some cases. But make sure that you're familiar with it. If there are any special provisions, trusts are very, very interesting. As you know, I think in the state of California we got about 150,000 practicing attorneys, and each one of them will have a different view on how to write a document. So just because you've seen one trust document doesn't mean that that's the way it's always going to be. So get a hold of the document, do a thorough review, talk to the estate planning attorney if that's possible, and then check out the assets. A really good way to check out the assets would be to have a look at the latest income tax return. The income tax returns, as the CPA that you are, will tell a lot about the person's assets, what are income generating, any capital gains, losses, business properties, and that type of thing. So you have your document, you have your assets, and then what you're really doing is interviewing any family members, friends, neighbors, and that type of thing, just to find out what's going on. You know, are there any major issues at that time? With my situation, I often get dragged into situations when they're completely out of control. So one of the comments that you may ask is there any litigation going on? So you'd want to find out. It could be in relation to a business, it could be some you know, personal issues, it could, even with a lot of elderly folks, it could be a divorce type situation. So you really want to become familiar. Are there any estranged family members that may suddenly pop up, that type of thing. So you know, you really got to do a paper review in terms of documents, you've got to do a financial review, but you also got to do a family review. Make sure who the people are that are going to be maybe inheriting assets, or even more significantly, people who aren't going to be inheriting assets but feel they should be inheriting assets. So a lot of dynamics.
So you may be stepping into a role as a referee that you may not really be prepared for, and not only that, then also looking at the finances of the family. Is this a financial situation that you feel that you can handle and can manage? Now, you might be able to get some support and do it with a CPA, with a good attorney, and so forth. But if it's really over your head, bearing in mind that you are taking on really substantial liabilities, being a fiduciary or a trustee or executor, you take it very seriously before you make that decision. And it's going to be very time consuming. So there are a lot of people think, oh, yeah, just waive the fees. And then when you get involved with it, you say, man, I should have doubled the fees.
Exactly, yes. And one of the points you bring up there, Mike, is really with regard to what the person who passed away or maybe incapacitated had put in place. And maybe they do have an excellent team, they could have a good attorney, good CPA, and a good property manager. But a lot of the generation, unfortunately, we're seeing them pass away right now, but folks that are now in their 80s or maybe early 90s, they've done everything themselves for their entire lives. If they've got rental properties, they fix them themselves. Which, as they're in declining health, you can imagine the properties aren't very well fixed up. So what the professional fiduciary will do is very rapidly assemble a team. If there's not a good CPA, bring in somebody such as yourself. If there's not a good attorney, bring somebody in that's good. The properties have to be managed. Even if it's a distributing trust, you want to make sure the roof's not going to fall down, the tenants are paying their rent, you've got a lot of liability with real estate, and so that all falls on the shoulders of the trustee. So really one of the things that I do when I'm stepping in is to look at the existing team, see whether you need to add to the team, replace some of the team members, because you're in this 100%. You can't be slightly a trustee. You're either all of a trustee or you're absolutely out of the picture. And I think this was your initial comment there, Mike. What do you need to look at before you accept the job?
Yeah.
And I understand from my attorney colleagues, I'm not an attorney, by the way, but my attorney colleagues advise me that there are a couple of different ways of accepting a trust. One is you can sign a consent, and so it's a formal document saying I hereby accept the role to be the trustee. The other way to do it is to just start doing the job as a trustee. So you become a de facto trustee. So you just step in, or in some cases blunder in and start doing the job of trustee. Hey, you're the trustee at that point because you've taken affirmative action or started controlling those assets.
Okay. What standards does a professional fiduciary have to meet in California in order to be licensed? And how many trusts do you need to manage before you're subject to these requirements?
So if I can answer the last question first, because I think that's what the attorneys always do.
Okay.
So
that way you don't lose track.
Right. Yeah, it's easy to remember the last part of it. But it's 3 or more cases in the state of California that somebody would need to be licensed as a professional fiduciary. But of course, as you can imagine, with legislation, there are all sorts of loopholes and everything going on with that. So the 3 cases would not apply if, for example, you were a trustee over a series of family trusts. So if you had an extremely wealthy family that had all sorts of trusts for the children, the grandchildren, and the nephews and nieces, that would only still count as one trust because they're entities within the same family. If you were a trustee for a spouse or a domestic partner, something like that, that wouldn't count. So there are all sorts of exemptions. CPAs in their standard course of practice would not have to be licensed. Attorneys do not have to be licensed. Pretty much everybody else, even a stockbroker, would have to be licensed if they were acting, on their own outside of the brokerage firm. So in terms of the education, somebody with a 4-year degree can take the 30 hours of education that are required under the California licensing regulations, which are part of the Department of Consumer Affairs. So there's a 30-hour education requirement, have to do background checks through the FBI, fingerprints, which are all, of course, now electronic. So you have to run through a security and background check. And then there's a test, about a 100-question test, which tests elements of California law and also federal law as well as it relates to conservatorships, trusts, fiduciaries, standards of practice, and that type of thing. So there are, thankfully now some thresholds. This requirement came in July the 1st, 2008. So we're only really just 3 years into licensing for fiduciaries, but it's really something that was long overdue.